generalization between the low pressure system and the barometer, for example. Well, we don't really know how to intervene in the weather, but we could imagine changing, if we could somehow change or prevent that approaching low pressure system from moving in, we would change the behavior of the barometer. But we can't change the weather by intervening with the barometer, right? We can't put the barometer in some vacuum chamber and change the barometric pressure and hope for it to have any impact on the weather. So the counterfactuals that pertain to the behavior of the barometer are passive and therefore not causal. And the counterfactuals, and if you have active counterfactuals, that's an indication that the generalization that you're dealing with is dealing with causal mechanisms. So here is a conceptual space for locating general knowledge claims or generalizations. The three dimensions are C is fidelity to causal structure, A is degree of abstraction, and G is generality. And one of the interesting things, I mentioned that philosophy of science has for a long time focused on physics, and I think a lot of people, this is controversial to some degree, but a lot of people think that in general, the laws of physics, the laws of Newtonian mechanics, or relativistic mechanics, or quantum theory, are sort of in this region here, right? They're very general, they're very abstract, and in this region right here. They're general, they're abstract, and they describe the fundamental causal mechanisms that work in the world. I think it's fair to say that for ecology, this region right here is empty, or largely empty. Right? There's no sort of necessity to that. It's a contingent fact about our world, but there just aren't general, abstract, causal laws in ecology. Most of the action in ecology is more here. So one of the things that, one of the points that I want to emphasize is, when we think about the pursuit of general knowledge in ecology, we have to keep in mind, which of these spaces are occupied, or which areas in this space are occupied and which aren't. And so when I come back to our modeling efforts, I'll refer back to this idea. So, as a consequence, really, of this, of what regions in this space are occupied and what regions aren't, we face a kind of cognitive predicament in ecology, not just in ecology, certainly in the social sciences, and probably a lot of other places as well. We want two kinds of things, and the two kinds of things that we want pull us in different directions. Right? On the one hand, we want knowledge of causal mechanisms, right? We want causal understanding, because causal understanding is the key to effective strategies for intervention. Right? If you're going to be successful in intervening in ecological systems, there's no better recipe for that than a deep understanding of the causal structure of those mechanisms. Right? The causes are the sort of handles for manipulation and intervention. We also want knowledge that covers lots of situations. Right? We confront a diverse and heterogeneous ecological world, and whatever part of that world we're confronting, we want knowledge that gives us some handle on what's going on. The problem is these two things pull us in opposite directions. The more we invest in a detailed understanding, causal understanding of some particular system, the more we risk not knowing what the hell's going on when we encounter the next system, and that's just because of the uniqueness of and complexity of the causal systems that we have to interact with. And so there are two classic approaches to scientific explanation in the philosophy of science. Wesley Salmon, one of the real leading figures in the history of 20th century philosophy of science, talked about these as as he puts it, two venerable intuitions when it comes to scientific explanation. One of the venerable intuitions is that explanation is a matter of telling the causal story. Right? We explain by rehearsing the causal details. Why did the plane crash? Because it flew through a flock of geese, and the geese got sucked up into the engine, and the engine quit working, and the plane crashed. Or, as in the case of what was the guy's name? In New York, he landed it in the Hudson River, and everybody got off. So that's a causal explanation. But we also value unification. That is, we value accounts that bring a wide range of different phenomena under the same explanatory scheme or the same explanatory framework. It's interesting. Two of the people that I've worked with a lot, well, Wesley Salmon is one, and Philip Kitcher was my dissertation advisor. Each of them took one of these venerable intuitions and based their theory of explanation on it. So Wesley Salmon's account is a causal account. Philip Kitcher's account is an explanation by unification account. But neither of them could resist the temptation of the other venerable intuition. So Wesley Salmon said, well, explanations are causal explanations, but they also manage to unify because there are just a few fundamental causal mechanisms in the world at work. So once we describe the mechanisms, our explanations will also unify. Well, that's basically assuming that all the actions up here, right? And it's very uncharacteristic of Wesley Salmon to do that, right? To sort of smuggle in an empirical assumption like that, but he did. My advisor, Philip Kitcher, was less subtle, but in some sense more effective. He simply made it a necessary truth that the explanations that do the best job of unifying in the end of science, right? When science is finally done and it's got the accounts that unify the phenomena, we can read the causal structure off of those explanations, off of those deductive relationships, and that's true. But that's necessarily true. So one of the things that I argue in the book that Charvel referenced is I argue for a two virtues approach to explanation. That is, I argue that both of the venerable intuitions need to be taken seriously. That most of our explanatory efforts contain a mixture of those two virtues. Some are more toward the causal end, some are more toward the unification end, but both kinds of things are valuable. And they're both valuable because of this cognitive predicament that we're in, right? That on the one hand, we want to know about causal mechanisms, but on the other hand, there are a lot of things we need to be able to interact with and deal with, and so we want explanations that unify as well. So that's the situation with respect to general knowledge claims. There's not sort of one desiderata. There are different things that we can pursue. Sometimes we have a particular system that we want to manage, then we need very concrete, specific causal knowledge about that system. Sometimes there are, systems that we want to manage, and they're so complex that we really can't gain any detailed, concrete knowledge. Then, we need relationships like the relationship between the barometer and the storm, right? They're phenomenological, they're not causal, but if they have enough gnomic force, if they're invariant enough, they can still be useful in the design of at least anticipating nature, right? If not intervening. And sometimes, let's see. Sometimes, well, I'm going to talk a little bit about in the next part of the talk. I'm going to talk about the theoretical ideas, right? So some of the ideas that some of the more theoretical ideas are really not about the behavior of actual systems, but they're more about the dispositions of ecological phenomena. They're about ecological systems can do, not about what they do. And I'll talk about that in the next part of the talk. So I'm going to shift to to the way that we use models then to pursue these different kinds of knowledge. But I had to give the biologists a chance to relax and put a picture of at least one organism in the talk. Actually, this is Stuart. Stuart gave me a crash course in PowerPoint last night, and he showed me. But as you can see, that's even shape. So back to what back to the philosophy. Okay, so part 2. Using models to advance our cognitive aims. Okay, so we have these various cognitive aims. We want to sometimes understand concrete systems, and sometimes we want to understand broader patterns, and so on and so forth. I'm going to say very little about statistical models. I mean, they're very important. I mean, there's an important paper by James Woodward and was it Bogan is the other author? Yeah. I think was it called Data and Phenomena? I think that's the title. And it's a very interesting paper about the way in which measurements, data, really need to be turned into phenomena, right? The patterns that Stephen was talking about are phenomena, right? And you get the phenomena after you do the measurements, and in some case, apply the statistical models to turn that into data. I'm not going to say much about that. Causal models to elucidate mechanisms, and theoretical models to explore ecological possibilities. And so I'm going to say more about the causal models, and probably a little bit more yet about the theoretical models. Now a little bit about the trade-offs in model building, and then the idea of theories or models as conceptual tools, and some methodological reflections, and then so that my abstract was not a total lie, I'm going to come finally at the end back to individual-based models, but we'll see how much time there is for that. Speaking of which, are you keeping track of time, Charbel? How much? Where do we stand on that?
We have 26 minutes to speak.
How many?
26 to speak.
Thanks. Okay, so this is the little bit on statistical models, right? One of the things that Wesley Salmon emphasized in his work was what he called patterns of statistical relevance. Those are just the correlations, the barometer storm correlations, the patterns that Stephen was talking about in his pattern-based modeling approach, right? These are patterns, and they're important, right? I mean, because patterns constrain causal hypotheses. If something is not statistically relevant, if A is not statistically relevant to B, then it can't be part of the mechanism leading to B. So, and nomically strong statistical patterns can be useful, if not for intervention, at least for anticipating the behavior of the natural world, right? And that's, again, the example of the barometer in the storm, right? That those kinds of relatively invariant statistical patterns can be quite valuable, especially if we just don't have the time or the resources or the cognitive capability to get at a deeper mechanistic understanding. Causal models can be more or less mechanistic, and Stuart's going to talk about this, and so I'm not going to say that much about it. I'm just going to rely on a sort of intuitive notion, right? So if you look at the literature in ecology, there's been a movement for a long time for more mechanistic models. Right? And what does that mean? Well, it just means that there are parameters in the model that exhibit more fidelity to the causal structure that the model is trying to explore. And this will get a rise out of Stuart. More mechanistic models are not always better, right? It depends on the cognitive aims of the enterprise. And so maybe give an example from, I don't know if Washington is here or not, Washington, Pasha. in his talk, he had a series of parameters for predicting risk of desertification, and the parameters were weighted. And it came up in the discussion, well, what's the theory behind the weighting of the parameters, right? Why is one parameter, twice as relevant or indicative of impending desertification? And it turns out that he didn't get the weights from any theory. He got the weights from past measurements, from empirical, from probabilities. And so the question was raised, well, wouldn't it be better to have a more mechanistic understanding or a more mechanistic theory, underlying this weighting of the different parameters? And the answer might be, I don't know what Washington's answer would be, but the answer might be, well, yeah, it would be nice, but it might be that the Caatinga is a desert by the time we get the mechanistic understanding, right? So it all depends on what the cognitive goals are, and that's the theme I want to emphasize. So probably the most difficult part of all of this is theoretical models. Theoretical models I take to be our ideas about the abstract ecological dispositions. About in my book I talk about capacities and tendencies. They're not about what ecological systems actually do. They're about the possibilities. They're about what they can do, right? So I think the next slide gives some examples. Yeah. So this is way back in 1974, Robert May published a paper in which he showed that simple difference equations can lead to chaotic dynamics, and so that's a very abstract tendency, and its value is simply in indicating a kind of behavior that's possible for the systems. The spatial dimension of environments can facilitate the coexistence of species, right? That's the metapopulation stuff, right? That spatial scale is important. You might think you're looking at an extinction event when it's simply part of a larger metapopulation picture where you have differential extinction and recolonization over a series of subpopulations, and so. It's very important to have the understanding that space can do that, right? Spatial structure can enable this kind of thing to happen, and so these, in a sense, these theoretical ideas, this body of knowledge about capacities and tendencies. It's the toolkit or the background knowledge that ecologists bring to bear when they evaluate the plausibility of models and the plausibility of hypotheses. I think it's very important, and the development of it is very important. A couple other examples there that I really don't need to discuss. So we have another space. This is a space for theoretical models. So F is so the idea is that theoretical models are being used to try to understand these abstract dispositions and tendencies, right? So the model can be more or less faithful to the disposition it's trying to explore. It can be, there's a kind of a dimension of fidelity here. The model can be more or less abstract, and it can be more or less general, right? So, so here's a kind of schema to illustrate the way in which we use theoretical models to explore these theoretical ideas, right? I thought I had a slide on here about two senses of theory. I don't know. Did I blow right past it, or maybe it's coming up? I don't know. Anyhow, the two senses of theory sometimes we talk about theory, when we talk about theory, we mean models. And sometimes when we talk about theory, we mean these abstract ideas about dispositions and tendencies. The point that I want to make is that we use theoretical models to explore theory in the second sense, theory in the sense of abstract ideas about dispositions and tendencies. And the way that we do it is, you have a theoretical idea. Say it's, metapopulation stuff is a good example. For a long time, I mean, all the way back in 1954, the Australian ecologist Andrew Arthur Birch developed an idea in their big, thick, and really classic book, an idea called spreading the risk. Right? And essentially, it's the idea, it's the metapopulation idea, right? Essentially, it's the idea that you can have what looks like population regulation, even though what you have is extinction and recolonization events across a spatial area. And then in their 1984 book, that the idea came out again, and there was a Dutch ecologist named Rodingius who wrote about it, and there's this whole literature, but it just sort of, it went nowhere within ecology as a discipline. Partly, I think, because there were some sort of, Andrew Arthur and Birch were regarded as sort of cranks a little bit in some ways. But what happened in, I guess it was in the 1970s, I forget which year, Richard Levins developed a model, a metapopulation model, which essentially modeled the idea that Andrew Arthur and Birch had described. And the next thing you know, you have metapopulation theory, and and Hansky picks up the ball, and away we go. That illustrates the importance, I think, of having models that articulate these theoretical ideas. I mean, the idea was there early, and it just sort of laid around until people had a way to study it using models. And so the T1 that I have in mind here is like the spreading the risk idea. The M1 is the development of something like Levin's metapopulation model, and then you use the analysis of the model and draw out some analytic consequences. And in my book, it says only analytic consequences, but I added simulation here because I think that's another way in which to get some interesting consequences of the model. It doesn't have to simply be an analytic model. And then, through a process of theoretical argument again, you transfer back out of the model, back into the realm of the capacities and tendencies, hopefully with a deeper understanding of what is possible for ecological systems. So that's using models to articulate theoretical ideas. Using models to generate empirical expectations is like that. In particular, this part is the same, right? So use the example perhaps of Pedro La Rocha, the study of community extinction thresholds, the first talk in our session. You have maybe your T1 here are some ideas about island biogeography, right? And you move into the realm of models, maybe with the idea that, well, let's see what happens if we think not about islands as such, but about habitat islands, and think about island biogeography in a continental situation, right? And through the process of model development, you come to the conclusion that maybe in continental situations you might not expect to see the kind of sort of cool curves that MacArthur and Wilson came up with, and maybe you expect to see these thresholds, and then you have to develop some interpretive principles that will associate with the model parameters some parameters of real systems, right? And that can often be one of the trickiest things to do, and that's a way that you can use theoretical ideas to generate expectations about empirical systems. It's an indirect route, right? I mean, the model doesn't. The model in philosophy of science for theory application for a long time was a deductive model, right? You had a law that had an if-then structure, and then you had, statements about initial conditions that were the antecedent of the law, and then you just deduce the consequences, and that's the way you applied theory. This is a much more indirect route, and maybe an interesting, just brief example. Someone I worked with at Duke, an ecologist named Janis Antanovics, was studying. He had a really neat way to study. To separate genetics from the environment, he cloned a whole series of certain grass. I forget the scientific name. And then he planted the grass along an environmental gradient, planted the clones, right? And so now you've got you took care of the genetics, and so now you can see the impact of this environmental variable on that genotype. And he was interested in the impact of that environmental variable on the fitness of that genotype, right? And he had a theoretical model that he was, used to generate expectations about the behavior of that system. But now he had to find a way to associate fitness with properties of those grass plants. And the way he did it was by counting inflorescences. Well, that's not a perfect measure of fitness. I mean, sometimes we know that fecundity is not completely correlated with fitness, but he argued in the process of applying the model that was a good interpretation, or at least a good enough interpretation. And my point is that he needed to argue that, right? He needed to first be creative and find out and find that interpretation, and then second, he needed to argue the case that it was a plausible interpretation. So, sort of zeroing in on the conclusion here, models are conceptual tools. Sometimes we use them to deepen our theoretical understanding, which is our grasp of what's possible, and maybe what's likely, the behavior of ecological systems. Sometimes that's quite local, concrete, and mechanistic. Sometimes it might be more general, abstract, and phenomenological, or it might be some other combination of the above. The trade-offs come because the general knowledge that's possible in ecology is more in that corner of the space that I described earlier. Ecological systems are causally complex; they're heterogeneous in space and time, and we can't do everything that we want to do at once, and so we have to navigate the trade-offs, which I'm not going to talk about directly right now. So models are, relevant for exploring theoretical ideas, but they're also relevant for empirical inquiry. And in this case, we use them in the way that I just described, but we still have to negotiate trade-offs. So just a few methodological reflections. It's important to be clear on the cognitive goals the modeling effort seeks to achieve. This is a point that Steve made, and I completely agree with it. But I would add that sometimes the cognitive goal of the modeling effort might be to explore theoretical ideas. It doesn't necessarily have to be to explore some concrete system. So it just depends on what the goal is, and you just need to be clear about what the goal is. And then secondly, it's important to calibrate our expectations of modeling success to what the model is trying to do. Right? So it doesn't, I think, to me, make any sense to criticize a model for not being mechanistic enough if the model is not setting out to be mechanistic. And so we need to, I think a lot of controversy, in ecology, a lot of controversy, especially in theoretical ecology, simply, has to do with people just not paying attention to what modelers are trying to achieve. And they criticize them for building this kind of model, or criticize them for the fact that their model doesn't do this kind of thing when they weren't even setting out to do that kind of thing. So, another thing I think I worry about actually a bunch, is reification of the model. Models are works of fiction, some more so than others, and we should not move automatically from the predictive or unified success of the model to the reality of the entities and processes that it posits. Right? I especially worry about this because of the role of unification. Right? Some models can be quite successful at unifying a range of phenomena, even though they really are works of fiction. The entities and processes that the model talks about just aren't real. They just don't exist. And so there's always, I think, a concern to get carried away from, with the explanatory success, especially in terms of unification, to this is the way reality is. Nancy Cartwright has in one of her books, has an essay. The title is "The Truth Doesn't Explain Much." She's talking about this. Finally, what of IBMs? I think that IBMs are another kind of conceptual tool. I think that they can be used to explore any of the different cognitive goals that I've been talking about. I think they can be used to explore theoretical ideas as well as concrete empirical systems. I think they probably have a particular forte in the representation of the mechanistic representation of concrete systems, but I don't think they're at all limited to that kind of role. Like any other model, they must be evaluated in terms of theoretical assumptions that they make. The construction of the model, the shape that the model takes, or the form that the model takes, or the way that the behavior of the individuals is represented, doesn't come out of the blue. It's based on this broader body of theoretical ideas. In Stephen's talk earlier, he talked about all the work that's been done about foraging under risk of predation, and that's been studied in all sorts of ways, and it's been studied theoretically and experimentally, and we know, I think, now a lot about that, and he was able to build that knowledge into his model, I think, in important ways. But I would, I would regard the whole sort of body of work on foraging under risk of predation as all contributing to a deeper understanding of that, and not just understanding particular systems, but also the more general models that work on that. I think maybe there's, just as IBMs have a special sort of forte for mechanistic representation of concrete systems, there maybe is a special sort of need for vigilance in IBMs. I worry a little bit about the independence of the patterns, right? So when an individual-based model is built to represent or to replicate certain patterns, and it does that, that's great, but I feel a lot better if it says, well, there should also be these other patterns. Now let's go see if they're there, and if they are, then I think that's an important thing. So there should be, I think, some independence in the data that's used to build and parameterize the model, and in the data that's used to test the model. That's it. Thank you.